So Riot just released the patch notes for the new balance patch that will go live on Wednesday. And there are a lot of buffs and nerfs to some very important cards. Today we're going to talk about the revival of Riot's own Metagame Snapshot, all of the cards that are getting changed, and a few bug fixes that actually end up buffing a few cards. Let's jump into it. Let's start with Riot's own Metagame Snapshot. It's back, at least for now. The last time we got one was in patch 1.14, which was back in November last year. I won't spend too much time on this, but there are a few reminders that I want to touch on, as well as a few decks that have gotten a new lease on life in the meta recently. Let's start off with the reminders. Riot's data covers all games and decks used from Platinum, Diamond, and Masters ranks across all 4 regions, as opposed to Mobalytics, which largely does the same, but splits the games into Masters and non-Masters. And you can either combine the two into one big data snapshot or keep them separate. The decks are only considered meta and make it into Riot Snapshot if they have at least a play rate of 3% or higher and a win rate of 50% or higher, although when it comes to balance, they also consider decks with a low play rate but a high win rate. 55% win rate and 15% play rate are their benchmarks for corrective balance. As far as the decks on their snapshot, there's not much to say. Nearly all the decks that were shown you can find on pretty much any other meta snapshot that's made by players in the community. The one that does stand out is Braum Vladimir, which does have a slightly lower than 3% play rate at 2.9%, but is definitely not a meme anymore, like it historically has been. Make no mistake, this deck has been pretty good the past few weeks, and while it does kind of rely on the Scargrounds and Crimson Bloodletter to have a truly high win rate, it can definitely win games without them. Alright, let's jump into the card changes, starting off with the champions. First off, we have Twisted Fate, who now needs to see you draw 9 cards to level up instead of 8. I'm a bit disappointed in this nerf. I was really hoping they'd give Twisted Fate the Ezreal treatment that Riot did in a previous patch of needing to see 10 cards drawn to level up. Granted, Ezreal needed to target 10 things was basically a stopgap before Ezreal's rework that we have now. With the other nerfs to TF Fizz that are in these patch notes though, I'm overall okay with this change. TF is still going to be a very good champion in decks that didn't focus on leveling him up quickly, which was anything outside of Bilgewater and Piltover and Zon. He will still force 2-for-1s from opponents. Next we have Fiora, who is now a 3-2, down from a 3-3 at level 1, and a 4-3, down from a 4-4 at level 2. This is a pretty big nerf. One of the biggest reasons to play Fiora was because she was a 3-3, even for dedicated Fiora combo decks. While the combo variants aren't hit as hard, since they have more ways to protect Fiora, every Fiora deck is going to feel this nerf, especially Fiora Shen midrange. So many cheaper units now trade up against Fiora and force the Fiora player to spend more cards to protect her more often now. Up next we have Jarvan IV, who is now a 6-4, up from being a 5-3 at level 1 and a 7-5 at level 2, up from being a 6-4. This is the buff Jarvan needed. My biggest and only problem with him was his low stat line for being a 6-drop, even with Barrier, because Barrier isn't that hard to deal with for some decks. I don't know if this will catapult Jarvan into even a tier 2 deck, but it's going to be interesting to see where not only Jarvan, but Demacia in general ends up over the next few weeks. Next we have Shyvana, who's been reverted to a 3-4, down from a 4-4, but now has Fury at level 1. Why? This is the change I hate the most in this patch. Now, to be fair, Riot has a philosophy of doing trades when it comes to buffs and nerfs, meaning if they add something to a card, then they will also take away something from either the same card or another card in that same region. But they really didn't need to revert Shyvana back to 3 power in exchange for Fury. I think because of that, Shyvana still sees 0 play at higher ranks, despite the Fury tag on level 1. She really needed to be a 4-4 at level 1 with Fury to be viable, and she'd be far from broken. On top of that, Shyvana still has to actually be in play in order to level up. Another change I was hoping they'd make if they didn't add Fury to her level 1. Next we have Lulu, who is now a 3-3, up from a 2-3 at level 1, and a 4-4 at level 2, up from being a 3-4. This was another change I wanted for Lulu, but I mainly want to talk about how I think Lulu should be played going forward. I think some people are underestimating this buff. While I do think Demacia is still the best region pairing for Lulu, I think where we went wrong a bit was trying to build a Lulu deck in a mid-range style similar to Fiora Shen. Some have said Lulu was just a worse version of Fiora Shen, but if you try to build it like Fiora Shen with the exact same curve of units and shove a bunch of 6-drops in there, despite those 6-drops being individually good cards, then of course you're going to come to that conclusion. I think in reality, support is an aggro deck, and that buffs to their attack stat help them more than other types of buffs. Even Lulu's card package kind of facilitates that, especially when you look at Young Witch. We might start to see Lulu now between this buff and the nerf to Fiora hurting Fiora Shen decks, but I still think Lulu needs to be built like a fast, tempo-oriented aggro deck. Similar to Nightfall aggro with Diana, where you take control of the board early and never give it back. Not so much like another Fiora Shen. Other region pairings are possible. Targon might be worth a revisit, even though it was absolutely terrible during Monuments of Power. And I could even see Noxus working. Alright, moving on to the followers and spells. First off, we have Pick a Card, which now costs 2 mana instead of 3, and only draws 2 fleeting cards next round instead of 3. I was expecting Riot to go the other way on this and nerf Pick a Card to 4 mana with no other changes. I've been saying this for a long time now. With all the cards we got during the last 3 sets that make up Call of the Mountain, there are so many cards that create additional cards in your hand that Pick a Card at 3 mana basically has no drawback now. You can easily create an extra card out of thin air to just put back into your deck instead of an actual card, as TF Fizz and other TF decks have proven. This change still makes the card playable, in my opinion, but it still might be too good, since drawing 2 cards for 2 mana in Legends of Runeterra is still above the normal rate. Next we have Wiggly Burblefish, who is now a 2-1, down from being a 3-1. This was a change a lot of people in the community were calling for. The other possible change was increasing Burblefish's starting mana cost, but ultimately going up to 7 or even 8 mana might still make the card too powerful, considering how easily and quickly TF Fizz decks could cast spells since they were so cheap. This will make aggressive Magic the Gathering quote-unquote Delver style strategies less appealing, since the damage output goes down quite a bit even when copying Burblefish with iterative improvement. I could see Burblefish eventually coming back, but I think it'll be out of the meta for now. Next we have Dreg Dredgers, which has been reverted back to a 2-1 from a 1-1. I am not surprised by this change. In fact, I even expected it given how badly Deep decks have been performing. Although I do think Deep was a hidden, underrated deck that had the tools to beat Lysandra Trundle at the very beginning of the new expansion. Unfortunately, those decks kind of fell off the past week or so, not because Lys Trundle is bad, but because TF Fizz and Aphelios decks just dominated everything else. Anyway, Deep got their strong 1 mana playback. We'll see if it's enough between this card and another card we'll be talking about in a bit. Next we have the Dreadway, whose cost has been reduced from 9 mana to 8 mana. I've got a lot to say on this one. This was another change that a lot of the anti-timelines players were asking for, and I was fully on board with this change. Just as a quick recap, the Timelines deck I'm referring to is Kindred Timelines, or what I think was a better name for it, Ledros Timelines. You would play Concurrent Timelines to transform every unit you played into another unit of the same cost for the rest of the game, and you'd get to pick from 3 units which one you want it to transform to. When you played Commander Ledros, his ability would get added to the spell stack. Then he would transform. One of the units he could transform into was the Dreadway at 9 mana, and if that happened, Ledros' ability would deal double the damage. That means that if your opponent's health number was an even amount, their Nexus would go to 0, regardless of the health, and you would automatically win the game. If the health number was an odd amount, then the Nexus still goes to 1 health. I need to be very clear on something because I've gotten into some arguments with other players when it comes to Ledros Timelines, mainly on Twitter. But this is something everyone needs to get in their heads. Just because a deck, quote unquote, isn't meta or is only tier 3 doesn't mean it isn't a problem. I'm fully aware that Ledros Timelines had a win rate below 50%. And yes, outside of Commander Ledros, Concurrent Timelines is a very neat card that opens up a lot of deck building possibilities. But you can't have a card that just automatically wins you the game 60% of the time, no matter how badly you played, or what decisions either player made earlier in the game. Too many people have this ranked player focused mindset of not meta, therefore not a problem, when that's one of the worst ways you can go about doing balance changes. So I'm happy about this change. Not only does it get rid of the Ledros Timelines interaction, but this actually buffs the Dreadway, and by extension, more mid-range or even control style Gangplank decks. All right, next we have Shadow Assassin, which is now a 2-1 instead of a 1-2. So for the past few weeks, I've been thinking about this card, and that Riot should possibly revert it back to being a 2-2. The main reason being that Ionia as a region is so bad off that they desperately need a staple unit that can be played in almost any Ionia deck. There's Eye of the Dragon, which you can't even play in every Ionia deck, and that's pretty much it. While this isn't a full revert, a 2-1 is acceptable to me. Shadow Assassin still dives to pings and can still be a tempo loss in some situations. I can't stress this enough. Targon really stole Ionia's thunder as the premier region for control decks, and it's the main reason why Ionia has a lack of identity right now. Or at least from a competitive player standpoint, the identity they do still have isn't viable for ranked play. Next we have Fey Guide, which is now a 3-4 up from being a 3-3. I'll take this change. Personally, I think this card was already pretty good, and I don't know why it gets the hate it does from some people. Granting a unit one of the most hated and efficient keywords in the game, on top of getting a body for 4 mana, can't be bad. The fact that people would rather play Swole Squirrel over this in some decks kind of baffles me, though I somewhat understand because Swole Squirrel has more combo potential with certain cards. But if it's something like playing either card with Vi, for example, Fey Guide effectively does the same thing, but more efficiently. Anyway, while this isn't going to bring Fey Guide to a point where it's everywhere in Ionia decks, I do think this is a buff to Lulu decks, since giving her elusive is quite good, since I think Fey Guide should be considered as a 2-of in those types of decks. Next, we have Legion Rearguard, which is now back to being a 3-2, up from being a 3-1. Riot did state that this revert was due to cards that have been released that were strictly better than Legion Rearguard, which is funny because the one card that comes to my mind is Bloodthirsty Marauder from Shurima. And while Shurima doesn't play it, and there are other cards I can think of that were better than Rearguard, Bloodthirsty Marauder was the literal definition of power creep. This card was a menace as a 3-2 though back when the game first officially released. But with all the access to efficient healing that Targon has, and none of it getting nerfed in this patch, I doubt something like classic burnt aggro will see play rates on the same level of early rising tides, if it's good at all. Next we have Sea Scarab, which is now a 2-3 up from being a 1-2. I was a little low on this card when it first released. I didn't know why deep decks clamored to play this when it was fairly easy to remove, unlike Thorny Toad. But this change makes it quite dangerous. I think it's even better than Thorny Toad now, at least in a non-aggro meta anyway. This is very likely an even bigger buff to deep decks than the Dreg Dredgers revert. Maybe those Maokai Mill decks are good enough to be viable now with this too. Alright, next we have Esteemed Hierophant, which now advances your Buried Sun Disc 3 rounds instead of 2. This is a change I appreciate because Sun Disc decks are way too slow right now, and their payoff, in my opinion, isn't even as powerful as Targon's Invoke package with Celestials, which is also much faster to pull off, by the way. Despite this buff, I think Sun Disc decks will continue to sit on the sidelines, and we'll need to wait until we get more cards from the next 2 sets for this deck to be viable. This buff won't be enough to carry Sun Disc decks on its own right now. Next we have Callous Bonecrusher, which is now a 6-4 instead of a 6-3. This is another change that's nice, but I seriously doubt it makes an impact in ranked. Mainly because Shurima also has access to another 4-mana follower called Bakai Sandspinner, which is still much better than this card, and only has 2 less stats in total. Never mind the other 4 mana options that other Shurima decks would rather play, Renekton just being one of them. Riot did state that the main purpose of this buff was for Expedition, which I could see this card having more impact there. Next, we have the Moon Weapons, which now all cost 3 mana instead of 2 mana. Aphelios decks are going to have to completely rework their package with this change. The whole round 1 Lunari Dustbringer, round 2 Bank Mana, into round 3 Dusk Petal, into Aphelios, into Crescendum, normally nabbing Boxtopus, is no longer possible. So I think for now, Aphelios is gone. Aphelios made so many other good Targon cards that people forgot about less desirable to play because of Aphelios' value engine, combined with the Veil Temple giving you additional mana to work with for Aphelios. He didn't even need to level up to be as impactful as he was. Some people are memeing that Taliyah is useless now, but honestly, I think Taliyah has better things to be doing than that make her stand out, more than simply copying the Veil Temple. Because as good as that was, you were just playing a worse version of another Aphelios deck at the end of the day. Next, we have Gifts from Beyond, which now costs 1 mana instead of 2 mana. Riot did want to keep the total mana cost of playing Gifts from Beyond and a Moon Weapon the same, so that's the reason this is getting buffed to cost 1 mana instead of 2. It's a nice change, though it still won't see a ton of play with Aphelios because while you can grab a Moon Weapon in a pinch, it still interrupts the Moon Weapon that Aphelios phased earlier, ultimately. And the final card change is the Veil Temple, which now grants +1/+0 instead of +1/+1. Another big nerf that a lot of people in the community were suggesting. When I first heard this suggestion, I was a bit skeptical that it wouldn't be enough to drop its playability. This seemed like a slap on the wrist initially. Several others, including myself, wanted this to just refill spell mana only instead of normal mana as a nerf. But the more I think about it, the more impactful I think this nerf is. To the point where unless Aphelios players figure out how to rework his package, the Veil Temple will no longer see play. It's a lot easier to remove the buff targets now that they're not getting a health buff. Personally, I'm glad though, for the same reasons I'm happy about the Moon Weapon nerfs. The Aphelios package basically pushed out all the other strong options in Targon, and Targon didn't even need a powerful set of cards like this one anyway, in my opinion, but it is what it is. All right, moving on to some bug fixes. I won't spend too much time on these, but there are a few that I wanted to point out that kind of indirectly buff certain champions. Kindred now correctly counting marked targets from previous rounds towards their level up as a small buff. I believe this did happen to me personally once, and as someone that's been messing with Kindred, I appreciate this fix. It's not going to make Kindred insanely better, but it's one less thing that was making Kindred even more gimped than they already were. Granted, I think Kindred is a bit underrated right now. Katarina, Victor, and Draven's effects are being changed from play to on summon, which means that any card that resummons them will trigger their abilities, and they no longer have to be played from hand. This has the most applications with, once again, Shadow Isles. In particular, Katarina with the Harrowing, on a turn where you don't have the attack token, will all of a sudden give you the attack token due to her rally effect. And finally, this isn't a champion fix, but Lucky Find will no longer count as triggering a second spell cast when selecting one of the 3 effects it gives you. This marks the end of the Lee Sin Shurima decks that were being played by a few people, myself included. Personally, I'm a little sad, but at the end of the day, Shurima Lee Sin was overall worse than Targon Lee Sin, just because while you could level Lee Sin up very quickly due to this bug, you had no way of guaranteeing overwhelm for Lee Sin. And because of that, I could argue that even Noxus Lee Sin was a better deck than Shurima Lee. But that's more debatable. Shurima is better at protecting Lee Sin than Noxus is on the flip side. And that's it. If you guys made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for the support. If you enjoyed the video, let me know by hitting the like button below and leaving a comment. If you don't want to miss out on future videos, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to click the notification bell below to guarantee that you don't miss a video from me. Also, feel free to check out all the other social media places I hang out at. I'm pretty active on Twitter, but you'll find links to my Twitch stream, our community Discord, in addition to my Twitter in the video description below. Thanks again for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I'll see you all next time. Take care.